Hello and welcome to Face to Face. Our guest today is Gwen Barlee. Gwen is with the Western Canada Wilderness Committee in Vancouver, I think, and we're going to be talking about some environmental issues, but predominantly electricity and the run-of-river projects that you may or may not have heard about. These projects have not gotten a lot of coverage in the media, but they are huge and, to my way of looking at it, potentially very damaging, both environmentally and, as you're going to hear, economically as well. So Gwen, maybe you can tell us something about what you do with Western Canada Wilderness Committee and what's going on.
I'm the policy director with the Wilderness Committee. And the Wilderness Committee is an environmental organization. We're a grassroots organization that was founded 30 years ago in British Columbia. And we've grown to 30,000 members and another 40,000 supporters. And so we work on environmental issues ranging from climate change, battling climate change, to protecting wild salmon, to trying to have BC get an endangered species law, to protecting parks. So it runs a gamut of environmental concerns. And one of the campaigns that we've been working on very actively the last 3 years is this gold rush to stake creeks and rivers by the private power sector in British Columbia.
Now, when you say a gold rush to stake creeks and rivers for private power in British Columbia, most people probably don't even know what you're talking about, because as I said, a lot of people do not know anything about this. So maybe you can just give us an overview. For example, I've heard that more than 700 streams and rivers have been claimed and are going to be somethinged.
Yes, well, you have actually 800 creeks and rivers and now even lakes, but water bodies right across British Columbia that have been staked by private power developers, and it includes the like of General Electric. And of course, General Electric is the 5th largest corporation on earth. And a lot of people sort of want to know, well, how did it start? How in 2010 did we end up with 800 creeks and rivers staked? And in 2002, the BC government introduced an energy plan, the 2002 Energy Plan. And in that energy plan, point 13 of the plan, it prohibited B.C. Hydro, which is our crown corporation, from producing new sources of hydroelectricity. And that's a really odd thing. And what that did, that directive, that triggered a gold rush amongst the private sector. And they went out, and pretty soon you had over 100, 200, 300, and now 800 creeks and rivers that have been staked by these private power companies. And it's funny, when I had first heard about this, initially,
when you say staked by private power companies, what does that mean?
It means they have a right in the future to be able to develop that stream or river for power through hydroelectricity.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're called run-of-river projects. And what you often do, you don't usually have a large dam, but you do have something called a head pond. And you do have a dam, or they're often referred to as weirs. You can have up to 95% of the flow of the creek or the river goes into a penstock, and then it goes down to a turbine which produces electricity.
Now that's worth repeating, because I think you said that up to 95% of the flow of the, you're saying
creek or
stream or river can be diverted and run down what?
It was run down a penstock, and it's a big pipe. Yeah, a big pipe. And the pipes can be, I mean, you have one for the Cliniclini, and I believe it's 10 meters by 10 meters. So significant, 30 feet. And then it goes down this penstock and it goes towards the turbine, and the turbine turns and it produces electricity. And then the water comes back, and it can be kilometers and kilometers later. It can come back to the original water body. Not always. Sometimes it doesn't come back to the original water body. And when people think, or at least I thought, and many people I've talked to since then, when they think of run-of-river projects, you think of a little turbine in a river. And the reality is far different. That these projects come with logging, they come with transmission lines.
Okay,
they come
so transmission lines, because these rivers are in the middle of the wilderness.
Oftentimes.
They're nowhere near an electricity line.
Sometimes you will have them maybe, 50 miles from an existing electricity line.
Right.
Other times it can be 400 kilometers from an existing transmission line.
So that means you're running a power line. You're cutting a channel through the forest 400 kilometers long in order to get the power
to connect it to the grid.
From the river into the grid.
Yeah.
Now this is called green power.
It is called green power.
Now who calls it green power? I know
well,
our
the private power
does.
industry calls it green power because I think they're trying to confuse British Columbians about what's actually happening in BC today.
And I'll say the media also calls it green power.
They do, although I think there's better education. That's gradually happening right across British Columbia, and it includes sectors of the media. But you do have it called green power, but I think a more accurate description would be low carbon electricity. And so it doesn't have, obviously, electricity that comes from hydropower. It has a low carbon footprint. But these 800 potential projects have a big environmental impact that the BC government has no planning anywhere in the province. So in the sea to sky corridor, you have about 150 creeks and rivers that have been staked by the private.
The sea to sky corridor,
yeah, and that's on the Lower Mainland
from
Vancouver right up to
Whistler.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's not a huge distance.
So in that area, there are 150 creeks and rivers that have been claimed.
Yes.
Which means that these people, a private company,
yes,
has the right to
develop,
get a license.
Yes.
To then
dam and divert.
Dam the stream or river.
Yes.
Divert up to, now you said up to 95%.
It can be. It depends.
In most cases, we'd assume it isn't that
well,
much.
It's the mean annual discharge, which is a scientific term for the water that goes, that runs in the creek. And what we're seeing when we're following these projects, it's not unusual to see 92%, 94%. And in some cases, we've seen 96%.
How can they take 96%?
I know. The problem is, one of the problems is that water for electricity is money. And so the more water they divert from the stream, the more money they generate through the electricity. And it was interesting,
And wait till you hear who's paying them this money, folks.
Absolutely. And I was talking to someone in government, and there is a standard within the BC government called the Hatfield Standard. And it's a precautionary standard that's applied to streams and rivers and how much water needs to be left in a stream or river. And it can vary a little bit depending on the water body. And I asked this person with the BC government, I said, is there any private power project in BC that meets the Hatfield Standard? And he said, no, there's no project that meets the Hatfield Standard, which is, again, a precautionary standard for leaving an adequate amount of water in the stream to retain that in-stream health. And so, again, you have these projects that they're, 150 on the sea to sky corridor. There's 200 creeks and rivers that are staked on the Sunshine Coast. And the BC government looks at each development as a one-off. They don't look at the cumulative impacts of all those transmission lines, all those road networks, all the logging, all the river diversion that's happening, and the cumulative impact on the landscape. And increasingly, you're seeing these projects in fish-bearing streams. What you're hearing, part of the PR spin, is that they're outside of fish-bearing streams, but we're increasingly seeing that they actually are in salmon habitat. They're in Dolly Varden habitat, they're in char, they're in eulachon habitat. And you have big projects, mammoth projects like the Butte Inlet, that's in the heart of grizzly bear habitat, it's in the heart of mountain goat habitat, and it's in the heart of salmon and wild fisheries habitat. And these projects aren't green, and the Wilderness Committee is strongly supportive of green energy, but we need to do it right. And we have 4 criteria, and the criteria is, number 1, we need planning. In BC, we have no planning.
It's a bit radical, isn't it?
I know, incredibly radical, incredibly radical. So we need planning. We need to know where are appropriate places for these projects and where there's not appropriate places because of high environmental values. Then we need strong environmental standards. And of course, BC has very low environmental standards that apply to these projects. That the Ministry of Environment's been gutted. It's been cut about 40 to 50% since 2001. And so we have, just to give you one example, the Environmental Assessment Office is an office that looks at projects, IPPs, private power projects, that are larger than 50 megawatts. And it has never once recommended that a project not proceed. It is just a rubber stamping office.
And which office is this?
It's the Provincial Environmental Assessment Office.
So they assess these projects.
They're supposed to assess, separate the good projects from the bad projects. But for some crazy reason, they've evidently never seen a bad project. So they've never recommended that an industrial project not proceed. So there's not a lot of faith, for good reason, that people have with the environmental assessment process.
But the politicians, Mr. Campbell, for example, can stand up there and say, well, there's a rigorous provincial environmental process that they're going to have to go through.
Yes, yeah, of course he has to say that, because also some of the jurisdictions where we want to sell this energy, such as California, require equivalent environmental standards. And so they have to say, of course we have high environmental standards in British Columbia. But actually what the Wilderness Committee is doing, along with Watershed Watch and some other organizations, is we've hired professionals to look at the environmental standards that apply to private power projects in BC and see if they're actually meeting a certain environmental grade. And I anticipate that analysis will be coming out in a couple of weeks. But what we've seen so far, very, very low standards. So no assessment of cumulative impacts. Provincial Environmental Assessment Office that doesn't look at projects that are under 50 megawatts, which is a vast majority.
Now, how much is 50 megawatts?
Well, it's hard to, a megawatt is a unit of energy.
Yeah.
And so if you have, and maybe you'll be able to pull it up later, the Ashley River is a 49 megawatt project. And that's the private power project that's there. And it can be a pretty significant project that you can have. And that was a project that I went up to about 3.5 years ago when it was being built.
Okay, so this is one project and it encompasses a couple or more rivers and streams? Is it just one river?
Sometimes it's one river, and sometimes they'll clump them together. It's one river.
Okay,
it's actually
so this
a creek.
is one river.
It's Ashley Creek.
It's a creek.
Yes.
And we're talking about 800 potentially rivers, creeks, and streams that are could be set up for these green power projects.
Yeah, and they're really
also called ruin of river.
Many people say ruin of river.
So what did you see at this? This was called the Ashley
Creek.
Where is it?
Yeah. And it's about probably 20 kilometers outside of Squamish on the Sea to Sky corridor, and that's again from Vancouver to Whistler. And I expected to see a little turbine in a creek.
You mean a little turbine sitting in a creek?
Yes.
Okay.
But really, sort of a bucolic thing. I didn't expect to see any footprint. I thought it would be something that, I just didn't think it would be a big deal. And we'd had someone phone us up, Tom Rankin, he's a rancher who lived near the Ashley and was watching what was going on. And he said, you need to dig beneath the surface. The Wilderness Committee needs to scratch beneath the green veneer and find out what's actually happening with his projects in British Columbia. And he phoned me incessantly. And finally I said, okay, Tom, okay, I'll come up. And we'll go up to the Ashley and I'll take a look at the Ashley. And I thought that would be the end of the story. And so we drive up to the Ashley and you see right away that there's been a whole lot of logging. You saw equipment in the stream, in the creek. You had
equipment in the stream. Now, this violates, I'm sure, British Columbia law.
You would think so.
Well, I used to be involved in forest issues, and I know you cannot...
well, we have pictures.
I'm joking. Well, I mean, that's what they say, but of course they do it all the time. They don't give a damn.
Well, and so...
Get it?
and you had a transmission line, and then what
So there's equipment in the stream.
In when we went up, there was equipment right in the creek. And you had... It was just like an industrial zone. And what was 10 years ago was a wild creek. And now you had an industrial zone. And we stepped out of the truck, and we were on a logging road, and a logging road is considered Crown land. And I was taking pictures, not of people that were working at the project. I was just taking pictures of the development. And we had security come up to us and say, you can't take pictures. And I said, well, why not? I'm on a public road. I'm not taking pictures of workers. I'm respecting people's privacy. And they go, because this is a private power project. And that was it was eye-opening.
I've never heard of anything like that.
Either did I.
And was he legally correct in saying that?
No, he's wrong.
Okay.
He was just
so far.
Yes, so far. He was just trying to, I think, exercise his muscle and trying to, they didn't want the public to see.
So you drive up a logging road.
Yes.
And you come to Ashley Creek.
Yes.
How big is it at the point where you're?
The diversion is about, I think, 7 kilometers, and so you could go up this logging road.
But how wide across is the
creek?
Is the creek? If you want to walk
depends
across
on. It probably range from 25 feet to, probably in some instances, maybe 150 feet.
Okay.
And it might even be larger than 25.
What time of year?
We were there. I've been there about 5 or 6 times altogether, and oftentimes near.
But this first time you're talking about?
First time. I think it was late summer.
So not that much water in the river.
No.
And they were still building it at that point. It wasn't completed.
No, it wasn't completed.
Okay. Yeah. So there's equipment in the stream, and what they're building is a dam, I guess, to dam.
Yeah, they call it a weir because a weir sounds better than a dam, and they don't want it. Yeah, it sounds a little bit more innocuous.
And nobody even knows what it is.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. But what it is you have you have this dam that's in place. It's a smaller dam than you'd have at big B.C. Hydro projects. But you also have road networks going in, and you had the transmission lines that are going in, and you had a lot of blasting because they had to bore a hole right through a mountain for this penstock, for this tunnel. Because
wait a second, they had to. Now remember, this is called green power, and this is This is even supported by some environmental groups in British Columbia.
Fewer and fewer. I think there were some groups, nearly like the Wilderness Committee at the beginning, that you hear the idea of run-of-river and it sounds good. And if you don't investigate what's actually happening on the ground, you could say, yeah, that's green power. But once groups started becoming better educated about the lack of planning, the low environmental standards, the fact that government didn't assess cumulative impacts, that we have 800 creeks and rivers staked in the province, they started looking, as they should, more closely at the issue.
But I understand that Tzeporah Berman, for example, who has become very famous in the environmental. In fact, wasn't she on the cover of Reader's Digest?
I think she was.
A short time ago. I think it was November of.
It might have been.
Might have been November of last year, and it was Tzeporah Berman, who many of you may have heard of, but she's definitely been knighted by the corporate media as the greatest environmentalist in British Columbia at this point in time, supports run-of-river projects, I believe.
It was surprising for many people, and I think Tzeporah is obviously legitimately concerned about climate change, as we all are. And she took a wrong turn somewhere, and I'm not sure where it was, and I think she thought it was maybe all right to sacrifice creeks and rivers in British Columbia in the hopes that it would reduce our carbon footprint. And I don't think she looked maybe as closely at the issue as she could have. But this is an issue that, I hate to see environmentalists pitted against environmentalists, because that takes away from the issue that we should be looking at, and that is having corporate control, such as General Electric, in charge of our creeks and rivers in British Columbia. And as I was mentioning earlier, there's a right way and a wrong way to do green power, and what the Wilderness Committee is saying, and increasingly other environmental organizations, okay, you need planning. You need high environmental standards. You need the projects to be acceptable to First Nations and local communities. And 4, the Wilderness Committee is calling for public ownership. And some people say, oh, that's an ideological position, but it's not. The private sector can still be involved in the design and building of these projects, but they don't need to own the means of generation. And there's a variety of reasons why, is because for energy security, for instance, when these contracts run out in 30 to 40 years with Plutonic Power or General Electric, these companies can sell their energy anywhere in the open market. So we could, in BC, could be bidding against California for energy that comes from our creeks and rivers.
Well, who's buying it for the first 30 or 40 years?
Who's buying it is B.C. Hydro is required to buy power through clean power calls. And this power is in excess to the needs of British Columbians, because again, private river power comes typically at the wrong time of the year for our energy requirements in BC. That spring freshet is a time when the snow melts in British Columbia, and typically you'll see the creeks swell up with excess water from the snow melt, and that'll happen during May, June, and July. And that's the time in British Columbia when we don't really need that energy. When we need our energy is when it's cold. So when it's December 25th and people are putting a turkey in the oven at 6 o'clock at night. And that's when many of these creeks are not generating much electricity, or far less electricity, because they're running at much smaller levels, and sometimes they're iced over, and sometimes they won't be producing any electricity. So it's become increasingly clear that this energy is for export, and the government's starting to say that. At first they tried to sell it as, we're in an electricity crisis.
That's right. We were told over and over again for years by the politicians and by the media that we were an importer of electricity and we needed more, and therefore that was one important reason why we had to start these run-of-river projects. Now we've been told by the British Columbia Utility Commission, which is a very important body in this province, and a very well-respected body in this province, although most people have never heard about it. They took a look at all of this and they said, hey, there's something wrong here, because really British Columbia does not need the energy from these run-of-river or ruin-of-river power projects.
And they said it wasn't in the public interest.
And they said it wasn't in the public interest what was happening. Now, this was given virtually zero coverage in the media, because, let's face it, folks, the media is owned by the same kinds of people, the corporations who are behind these programs. And when something important like this happens, they don't want the public to know about it. And that's the way things work.
But it was pretty shocking, you're right, when the BC Utilities Commission said, and that's supposed to be an independent watchdog that monitors BC Hydro. And so BC Hydro, in the last call for power, when they were required to buy this very expensive private power, and again, intermittent soft energy that comes at the wrong time of the year. And the BC Utilities Commission said, no, this isn't in the public interest. And so what the government's done, as is becoming increasingly obvious, that, okay, the power is not for British Columbians, it's in excess to our needs, and what we're going to do, we want to sell it to the Americans largely. And of course, the market that BC is on is California. And they want to meet a standard in California called their Renewable Portfolio Standard. And they're hoping, the BC government is hoping, that California will pay a premium for energy that meets their Renewable Portfolio Standard. But what's surprising for a lot of people is private run-of-river power doesn't meet California's renewable energy standard. And it doesn't for a variety of reasons, because the projects are often over 30 megawatts and it would affect in-stream flow. And so the government, the BC government's lobbying very hard to have California lower its standards. And also California also has an equivalency expectation, and they, if they're going to be importing power from a jurisdiction such as British Columbia, and it's supposed to meet their renewable portfolio standard, then they expect BC's environmental laws to be as high as California's. And California has some very robust environmental laws. And of course, BC, over the last 10 years in particular, we've gutted environmental standards in this province, and the Ministry of Environment is just a shell of itself. We have almost no biologists and hydrologists and scientists left on the ground to monitor projects. And so we don't meet California's equivalency standards when it comes to environmental protection. But it's really clear that this is where the government wants to go. And this is another part of the story that's shocking for people. So BC Hydro buys power in the last call for power is about $126 a megawatt hour. And a megawatt is a unit of electricity.
What does this mean? Like, I'm paying about 5 cents per kilowatt hour.
Yes. And so that would be about 12 cents, a little bit over 12 cents per kilowatt hour.
So BC Hydro is now buying power for 12 cents a kilowatt hour. Mm-hmm. I'm paying, and you folks are paying 5 or 6 cents a kilowatt hour.
A little bit over, yeah.
Now, BC Hydro has to buy this power from these projects, and BC Hydro is now on the hook for how much?
$27 billion.
BC Hydro is on the hook for $27 billion
in energy purchase agreements.
In energy purchase agreements over the next...
About 40 years.
40 years.
But that's not even including... BC Hydro is going to be buying more and more energy from these private power projects.
We're on the hook now for $30 billion.
Almost 30.
Yeah, I'm sorry, almost 30. But BC Hydro is being forced by the Campbell government to buy more and more of this power.
And what's horribly ironic...
If we can't export this power, if nobody wants it...
You can export it. But are you exporting it at a loss? Because on the open market, so we're paying $126 in the last call for power, BC Hydro being forced to buy this private power. And on the open market, they're lucky if they get $60 a megawatt hour.
Today?
Yes.
Okay.
So, and there's times during spring freshet, and again, that's the snow melt that comes May, June, July, where power in the open market electricity will be as low as $18 a megawatt hour.
And we are paying?
$126.
Okay, and when I say we, I mean we, because we are BC Hydro. We are the owners of BC Hydro. And there is, I would say, a very good chance that these projects could bankrupt BC Hydro.
Well, it's a concern. What's happening right now is BC Hydro has these contractual obligations of $27 billion to the private power sector for a very small portion of energy. In the scheme of things. And they're having, of course, to pass on those increases to ratepayers. And so you're seeing...
That's us.
That is us. That's citizens across the province. And so you're going to see electricity rates increase in British Columbia about 30% over the next 4 years.
And we've already seen them increase substantially. I just had the biggest hydro bill I've ever had.
Absolutely. And it's kind of crazy when you've had a very profitable Crown corporation such as BC Hydro. And between, what was it? It was between 1994 and 2006, BC Hydro returned $8.4 billion back to public coffers.
Can you say that again? Between 1994...
1994 and 2006.
BC Hydro
returned $8.4 billion to public coffers.
Now imagine if that was a private corporation, which it seems is like what they want it to be. That's $8.6 billion in profit.
Yeah.
Do you see what's happening here, folks?
Yes. And so, and that money from BC Hydro went into public coffers. It went towards schools and hospitals and libraries and things that we need in this province. It went towards the public good. And what we're seeing now, we're seeing a transfer of public assets, our streams and rivers, and the power they produce to the private sector. And so money that could conceivably be produced from, or energy that turns into money from Butte Inlet, will not go back to the people of British Columbia. It would go back to General Electric and their shareholders. And again, I want to be really clear. The Wilderness Committee, there's a right way and a wrong way to do green energy. And one of the things that you want to do first and foremost before damming and diverting any rivers is you want to fully engage in conservation. Conservation is the cheapest form of energy.
You mean, so we should, before we imagine that we need to produce more power, we should be doing everything we can to use less power.
Absolutely.
And we are probably among the greatest electricity wasters in the world. So there's lots of savings to be made.
There's lots of savings. If we roll up our shirt sleeves, we can do pretty well. And we just have to, we have to think very carefully what's at risk here. That when you're damming and diverting 50 streams, 100 streams, 500 streams, 800 streams, what are the impacts to the environment from those developments? And not only
damming and diverting, but building roads to them.
Transmission lines.
Transmission lines to them. You said some of them hundreds of kilometers long.
Yeah.
They're going to turn British Columbia into a fragmented patchwork environmental disaster. And that seems to be the plan, because that's what they are beginning to do right now.
That is what's going to happen when you have no controls, when you're absolutely losing control of a natural resource, when you have no planning, and when you have low environmental standards. And those are the ingredients that we have in British Columbia.
So Gwen, how can it be that nobody in the province virtually has heard about this? Nobody's talking about it?
I think actually people have, not everybody, obviously not everybody knows about this, but we've done some recent polling, and I think it showed about 55% of people were acquainted with what was happening. And the vast majority, according to the polling that we did, we asked them, we said, who would you prefer to develop hydroelectricity projects in British Columbia? BC Hydro or the private sector? And overwhelmingly, like 7-1, people said BC Hydro. Because they recognize BC Hydro takes into account, it's not just about making money, it's about balancing public good. It's about looking at environmental standards. It's about long-term planning. It's about energy security. And it's not just, and when you bring corporations into the picture, what corporations do, what they're required to do, is produce value for their shareholders. And that becomes the overriding emphasis point of their developments. And so we have a crazy, chaotic situation in British Columbia, and you have corporations, and increasingly large corporations like General Electric, that are coming into the province and staking our creeks and rivers. And I'm really afraid that in 40 years we'll wake up with hundreds of creeks and rivers owned by General Electric, and we'll say, what happened?
How many does General Electric own of these?
Well, they're in partnerships with Plutonic Power increasingly, and I think they've also entered into partnerships with some smaller firms that are just getting into the market. And so I know you're probably looking at over 30 at least, and I'd actually have to go back and count.
30 projects?
No, 30 creeks and rivers.
Okay.
And I think you'd be looking at maybe a half dozen projects. It might be higher than that, because they're also starting to get into the wind sector. But I think it's nearly equivalent to what you saw maybe 20, 25 years ago in the farm fish industry in British Columbia. You had a lot of small players at the beginning, and then you had big corporations that came in and bought up the small mom and pop players. And there's a lot of money that's at stake in British Columbia with our rivers being staked, and the type of contracts that BC Hydro is forced to give to these companies.
$27 billion so far, and
that's not chump change.
More are being signed.
Yeah.
Now, $1 billion a year is about $250 per person in British Columbia. There's only 4 million of us. $1 billion is $250 a year per person. So a family of 4 will be happily giving $1,000 a year, and paying higher electricity bills, no doubt,
and in some ways
destroying our rivers.
And in some ways, there's an argument to be made, and a legitimate argument to be made, that electricity rates should be a little bit higher, because when they're a little bit higher, as long as you aren't causing energy poverty.
And where should that money be going, though?
Exactly.
Yes.
Where should the money be going? Should it be going back into the public coffers, for our libraries, for retrofits, for upgrading, public transportation? There's lots of ways we could be spending, hundreds of millions of dollars a year that's being generated.
Children's sports.
Absolutely.
Lower tuition fees for
that have been
universities,
cut.
yes.
And I also wanted to get back to a little bit about how the BC government was trying to sell the stake in Ever Creeks and Rivers. And originally they were doing
how they were
trying to sell to the public.
Oh.
The rationale for allowing hundreds of creeks and rivers to be staked. And they said, okay, BC's in an energy crisis, an electricity crisis.
And remember, there was no crisis.
No, there was no crisis. And if you actually look at some BC stats documents, and that's a arm of the government that crunches numbers and looks at statistics, and they show that for 8 out of the last, I think it was 11 years, up to 2007, 2008, that BC as a whole was actually a net exporter of electricity. And so, of course, when the government realized, okay, that crisis was actually manufactured, then they switched very quickly to saying, okay, we're going to provide low carbon electricity to the world, to California, but not saying we're going to be forcing BC Hydro to buy it at $126 a megawatt, and then selling it, if we're lucky, at $60.
All the money, all the water out of our rivers, building roads through rivers, building tunnels, cutting thousands of kilometers of transmission lines.
Easily.
Yeah.
And again, no planning.
Now, all this started actually under the NDP, didn't it?
No, the NDP dabbled with the thought of, oh, you know what, maybe it'd be interesting, and actually it happened before in the Socred government before that, maybe it'd be interesting to break the monopoly with BC Hydro and allow the private sector in to dabble, but it didn't go very far. You might have had 1 or 2 or 3 projects that started under those administrations. But where it really got started was in 2002 when the BC government, the BC Liberal government, came in with a huge mandate, and the opposition was reduced to 2 seats. And this was a mandate about privatization and deregulation when it came to BC Hydro. And when you go to the 2002 energy plan and you go to point 13, it says, it restricts BC Hydro from producing new sources of hydroelectricity. Now, they can do retrofits, they might be doing Site C, but they weren't allowed to engage or compete against the private sector when it came to run-of-river projects. And so it was very clearly an ideological perspective of this government to bolster the private sector and to contribute and continue on a deregulation and a privatization, slow motion privatization of BC Hydro. But they changed the landscape dramatically. And in the last 7 years, you've seen a 1,140% increase in water licenses for power given out by the BC government. And that's reflective of the direction that this government chose to take when it came to dismantling BC Hydro and proceeding with private power projects. And it's really important to also remember the history, because when a lot of people think that the BC government's found religion around climate change, and they've done some good things. They introduced the carbon tax, which is a step in the right direction. But when the BC government introduced the 2002 energy plan, which prohibited BC Hydro from producing new sources of hydroelectricity and then opened it up to the private sector, it had nothing to do with climate change. It had nothing to do with green energy. That was a period of time when the BC government was actually fighting the federal government against the implementation of Kyoto. And that's on the record.
So the Campbell government was opposed to Kyoto?
At that time, yes.
Because we have oil and gas in
they just didn't. They hadn't found religion around climate change, and so you have to remember that no matter how you spin it, no matter how you look at it, if you look at the historical record, that what it shows is that it was about privatization and deregulation of the electricity sector in British Columbia. And it's nearly like we have a perfect storm in the province. It's a financial disaster for ratepayers, for citizens of this province.
Because we're going to be paying so much more for electricity.
And also there's very little public benefit. I would say there's almost no public benefit.
And if we can't sell this power, we still have to buy it.
Well, you could, you'd sell it at a loss.
Yes,
that's what's going to happen the vast majority of the time. And then you have very, very low environmental standards, and you have no planning. And you have a situation that's chaotic. And we're losing control of our streams and rivers in this province because of the lack of planning and because of this government's just absolute, I don't know if it's a mandate, but they're on this mission to see BC Hydro weakened. And I'm really afraid eventually privatized at the end of the day. Yeah,
I would say if you look at it, you have to think that's where we're going. So, And how is it, folks, that we don't get to vote on this? We don't even really know about it. It just happens because that's the way our province is being run, and our country as well. So let's go back to the Ashlew Creek. So you went there for the first time. You expected to see a few turbines lying in the river.
Yeah, I just thought it would be this sort of, like nearly what you'd see, I don't know, in old mills when you'd go to England.
Like a windmill.
Or you see those big water wheels, those slow-moving water wheels, and you think, oh, isn't that lovely? What a non-invasive way of producing electricity. Boy, we can embrace that. And then I go up there, and there's machinery in the creek, and there's been all sorts of logging. You have transmission lines going through. You have security there. You have roads being punched in. You're seeing where, the weir is starting to be built.
The weir is the dam.
The weir is the dam. And you think, wow, this is an industrial project. And this is considered one of the smaller projects, being 49 megawatts, and again, not going through a provincial environmental assessment. And then I thought, wow, and there's 120 or 150 other creeks and rivers in that area, in that neck of the woods, that have also been staked by the private power sector. And the government's not looking at the cumulative impacts. And then you jump over to the Sunshine Coast, and there's almost 200 creeks and rivers. And then over to the Kootenays, and there are around 75 to 100 creeks and rivers that have been staked. And then I thought, we have a problem here. And it was an absolute wake-up call. Because I remember it was around 2003 or 2004, and we'd had private power producers knocking at our door at the Wilderness Committee, and we were, like many environmental groups, we were nearly running around like chickens with our heads cut off because there'd been so many cuts to the Ministry of Environment, and this had been a provincial government that had been incredibly hard on the environment. And so we weren't focused on run-of-river projects. We weren't focused on these independent power projects. We were focused on cuts to the Ministry of Environment, on rolling back funding for parks and things like that. And so when these private power developers met with us, we didn't look really closely at what they were saying when they said, oh, BC's in an electricity crisis and you need the moxie of the private sector to come in and save us. We thought, oh, well, yeah, maybe that's the case. And then we did our due diligence. And again, it was because of members and people like Tom Rankin who phoned us up and they said, you know what, this sounds really green. Run-of-river projects sound great. But you need to do your due diligence. You need to do your homework. You need to come out and visit some of these projects and find out what's happening on the ground. You need to see how the BC government's changed the lay of the land with the 2002 energy plan. And so then we did that. And it was incredibly eye-opening. And it was a difficult decision, but we thought we have no choice but to get involved. And again, we have the ability to do green energy correctly in British Columbia, to do it right. But shoving aside the public, having low environmental standards, no planning, and seeing a public good turned over to the private sector is not the way to produce green power. And something else that I wanted to bring up, there's some people that naively assume that for every megawatt of low carbon, let's say hydroelectricity that comes online, that you have a megawatt of coal energy that goes offline. And of course, that's not the case. And I wish it was the case. And you have a situation in British Columbia, and there's an area of the province in northern British Columbia, and it's called Highway 37, and it's not electrified. And the BC government's made a commitment to electrify this area. And most people think, oh, that's a great idea. There's several hundred people, probably a little bit over 1,000 people that don't have access to electricity in that region. And then what you realize, what actually Highway 37 is about, it's about having coal mines and smelting mines come online. 5 mines in this area, Clapham and Groundhog being 2 of the open pit coal mines that will massively increase greenhouse gas emissions in British Columbia. And not only is this low carbon power hydroelectricity being used to bring these dirty mines online, but because the big industry gets a subsidy, it's called the heritage contract, so they pay a really low rate, about $38 a megawatt hour for electricity. So that's a subsidized rate when you consider that the new electricity we're paying is $126.
But
they have a heritage contract that locks them into
coal mine can buy.
Yeah, so that's what they want. They want to access this heritage contract. So if they access this heritage contract, each mine, smelting mine and coal mine, will be subsidized millions and millions and millions of dollars annually. The smelting mines will be subsidized up to $25 million a year in cheap electricity. Now that's crazy.
And why would you guess who the fools are that are going to be paying this?
Yes. Yeah. And so many people say, when you're talking to people about what's happening in British Columbia today, they say, I can't believe it. Why would the government do this? It doesn't make sense ecologically. It doesn't make sense from a planning perspective. And it definitely doesn't make sense financially. So why are they doing it? And that's a good question. I don't know why they're doing it.
Oh, I know why they're doing it. They do it because they're not working for us. They're working for the very corporations who they're doing it for. We've lost control of our democracy in British Columbia and in Canada.
And I would say not completely. I think there is a democratic deficit in British Columbia and indeed in North America. But there are projects through people power that have been stopped and hopefully permanently stopped. And one of those projects was the Upper Pit. And the Upper Pit project was a contentious project that was near Pitt Meadows outside of Vancouver. And it was 7 streams and rivers and tributaries into the Pitt River that were going to be dammed and diverted by this company. All run of river. And this was one of the last wild salmon strongholds in the Lower Mainland. And because it was cheap for the company, they wanted to put the transmission line through a Class A provincial park, Pinecone-Burke Provincial Park. And people thought, this doesn't sound very good. And so because the project was over 50 megawatts, they had to go through provincial environmental assessment. Very weak process, but it does provide a venue for people to get together and voice concerns. And so people at the first environmental assessment process for the Upper Pitt River, there was about 60 people out. And then by the third one, there's probably 200 people out. And then by the fourth one, there was about 400 people out. And what was interesting about this is the proponent had a lot of say over where these meetings were being held, according to what I was told through talking to people in government. And they picked a really small room, I think it was Ramada Inn, and that room only held 150 people. And 400 to 500 people showed up and couldn't fit into this room to say, hey, we want to put our wild rivers and our salmon ahead of private corporate profits. And so people were trying to squeeze into this room that held 150 people, and the fire marshal was called, and they said, you have to leave. And people said, we aren't going to leave unless there's another meeting. And so the proponent was forced to have another meeting. And then they picked the largest room in town, and that was a gymnasium that held about 1,000 people. And over 1,000 people turned out. And it was loggers and fishers and environmentalists and grandmothers and grandfathers, and it was the whole community. And they said, no way are you damming and diverting these creeks in the middle of salmon habitat, and no way are you putting a transmission line through a public park. And they managed to stop that project. But it wasn't because of high environmental standards, it was because of people power. And
we never really heard about that story either, although it's a great story. Can we go back to Ashlew Creek again?
Yes, absolutely.
Once again, this is the first project that you visited. Yes. It came as a big surprise because you thought it would be very pastoral and, yes, and nice. And
I thought it would be tiny, and I thought it would not have an impact on the environment, and I thought it would be sort of a gentle footprint on the environment.
So when you came, there was things going on in the river, there were logging, roads were being built, transmission lines were being built.
Yes.
Now, what were they going? They were building a dam called the Weir. Now, what happens with the water? You divert some water out of the river.
You divert it like a high, it can be up to 95% of the mean annual flow of the river, into a pipe. It's called a penstock. And they'd be quite tall. They can be 10 feet high. They can be 20 feet high. Some cases like 30 feet in diameter. And then that water that goes into the penstock is diverted. Usually the penstock is pointed downhill because you need that power of the water going downhill, and it hits turbines to generate power. And it turns the turbines, and then it generates power, and then that power is fed into the grid. It goes to a powerhouse, and then that powerhouse hooks to a transmission line. That transmission line feeds into the grid. And then the water, and sometimes it'll be 5 kilometers or 8 kilometers or 15 kilometers or 16 kilometers, is eventually, nearly all the time, comes back into the river.
So this isn't a joke. I mean, this is taking almost all the water out of a river
portion, yes,
and running it for 5, 10, 15 kilometers outside of the river through a pipe, and then putting it back into the river. I mean,
and oftentimes, increasingly, we're seeing impacts of these projects in fish habitat, and not just char or dolly varden or bull trout, but increasingly in salmon habitat. And again, it's not just the impact of the water being diverted. When you have roads fragmenting the landscape, when you have transmission lines that can be hundreds and hundreds of kilometers in length fragmenting the landscape, and you have no planning in the BC, you have no assessment of cumulative impacts, you have a problem. And that's what we're starting to see in British Columbia. And if California, and I don't know if California will, and I'm hoping they won't, if California all of a sudden decided that the power being produced through private run-of-river projects in British Columbia met their environmental standards, met their renewable portfolio standards, we would see development go through the roof in British Columbia, even faster than it's happened. And also, once you turn on the taps to California, you aren't going to be turning those taps off. That there's a lot of concern about what are the impacts of NAFTA. Like what happens in 40 years when these energy purchase agreements run out with B.C Hydro, and maybe you have a different government in, and they say, you know what, this isn't in the public interest, and we want to, we don't want to issue any more energy purchase agreements. We don't want to renew the licenses. And what happens under NAFTA? And you have some people saying that under NAFTA, especially for Mexican and American companies, where there's an expectation to profit under Chapter 11, they could sue the BC government for loss of profits. And that's a huge concern, and it's something that hasn't been adequately evaluated in BC, and it should be. And, you know, we don't want to, in leaving to our children or our grandchildren in 30 or 40 years, having to bid against California for energy that comes from our creeks and rivers, let alone that we shouldn't be, California should be dealing with their energy issues. They should be dealing with lowering their environmental footprint. And there should also be an expectation that they deal with those problems before we start damming and diverting hundreds of creeks and rivers in British Columbia to feed that voracious beast, which is California. That, I mean, we're going to be in have a huge problem if we turn on the taps to California, because it'll be very difficult to turn them off.
And when you say turn on the taps, you mean start to send electricity down there because we can't stop.
Absolutely, and especially if we get locked into long-term contracts. And again, hearkening back to the fact that BC Hydro is buying this power, this private run-of-river power, at far, far above market rates. And right now, we're selling this power for half of what we paid for it, sometimes a third.
Yeah, to me, the biggest issue here is, I mean, aside from the environmental issue, which I find, I mean, it's catastrophic to our province, to the rivers and to the wild and the environment and the planet. We simply can't do it on that basis alone. But to have it all happen without the public even knowing about it, you know, I mean, if I hadn't been told by a friend about a year ago that these things were happening, I really wouldn't know about it either. It just, you know, where is our media? Why aren't they telling us this vitally important story? Do you have any idea how many projects are actually underway right now and being built?
There's probably about 35 to 40 run-of-river projects that are operating right now.
That are operating already?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And then there's, I'd say there's probably another 20 or 30 that are in the process of being built. And of course, we had an energy call that came out that announced another 19 projects last week. Some of those were wind projects, but a lot of them were run-of-river projects. And then there's supposed to be another call for power from BC Hydro for more private power run-of-river projects. And so I think it'd be safe to say that you could easily see another 50 or 60 projects being built, or 70 within a very short time period. And again, there is a potential, especially with this government, the BC government wanting to move towards exports, of having hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of creeks developed across the province. And there was actually a study done by Carewood Liddell, and they're, I believe, an engineering firm that had been hired by BC Hydro. And they looked at the potential for run-of-river projects in British Columbia through different lenses, like how much would be paid per megawatt hour. And they identified up to 8,000 streams and rivers across British Columbia that could be developed for hydroelectricity. And that's pretty scary.
Sounds good to me. 8,000.
Yeah. And not all of those obviously are going to be viable. I mean, you'd have to be getting a very high rate for electricity for many of them. But the fact that even if you had 1,000, I mean, that would dramatically change the landscape in this province.
So what should we be doing? What should we be doing right now?
We should have a moratorium on private power projects.
Stop it all.
Stop it all. And again, what the Wilderness Committee would say, have 4 criteria. You have planning. Wow, radical concept. You have high environmental standards, that the projects are acceptable to First Nations and local governments and local communities, and also that they're publicly owned. So we put public good ahead of corporate profits. And one of the things I just wanted to touch on in regards to local communities, a couple of years ago, I think it was actually 2006, the BC government passed a bill called Bill 30. And that bill took away the rights for regional districts and local governments to say no to these projects. So they effectively muzzled local governments from saying what creeks and rivers were appropriate to develop for power and which ones weren't.
So when did this happen?
2006.
And this was Bill 30.
Bill 30.
And it took away, because
the rights of regional governments to plan.
Local towns and cities were not happy with this and wanted a say.
Well, sometimes they actually wanted to have, maybe 10 or 11 creeks off limits because of high environmental values or spiritual values or values to First Nations. And so in some places that they had identified, they said, well, we don't want these creeks and rivers developed. And that actually happened with the Ashlew. And then what the government is also known, this Bill 30 is known as the Ashlew Bill.
Okay, so because the local communities did not want that.
No, and because they had many...
tact.
Yeah, they'd had meetings with the local community, and the community overwhelmingly said,
no.
Look, we don't want this project to proceed. And then what the BC government came in with, they came in with this so-called Ashlew Bill, which removed the rights not only of the Squamish-Lillooet Regional District to say no to this project, but for all regional governments right across British Columbia. So you're also dealing with something that is profoundly undemocratic.
So just compare, folks, the amount of coverage that has been given to Tiger Woods over the last little while with the amount of coverage that has been given to this issue. And when you think about that, think that it's not by accident that this is the way things happen, because they want you and me and all of us knowing about Tiger Woods, but they don't want us knowing about what they're doing, because what they're doing is destroying everything. That's what we're up against. So if people want to get involved with helping the Western Canada Wilderness Committee in this fight, battle, struggle, whatever you want to call it, how do they get in touch with you?
Well, you can go to our website, wildernesscommittee.org, or you can phone us at 604-683-8220.
So once again, wildernesscommittee.org.
Yeah,
and say the phone number a little more slowly.
604 683 8220. And we are increasingly having meetings and events across the province, and we try to publicize those. So actually we're having an event tonight in Victoria, and it's on Butte Inlet.
Now remember, this is being filmed at the end of March, so don't go anywhere tonight when you're watching this.
Yeah, but we'll be having future events in Campbell River and in Powell River and in Sea to Sky country. And it's just letting people know what's happening to their creeks and rivers and what's at stake in the province. And when people know, they stand up and they take action.
Yeah, and that's why they don't want people to know.
I guess so.
Who are some of the other players in this? On the corporate side, there's a group called Brookfield Asset Management.
Well, it's hard to keep track. Yeah, Brookfield Asset Management.
It's a very big Canadian corporation. If you Google Brookfield Asset Management, you'll find this is really the who's who of Canada.
Yeah, you have Pristine Power, you have Run of River Power, Plutonic Power, again, General Electric. But it's hard. I mean, sometimes these developments can be flipped amongst companies.
Yeah.
I think Interjex is another company. And so things are moving really fast amongst big corporations who realize there's huge profits to be made from the development of our creeks and rivers. And
what's happening on the side of truth, honor, and justice? Who are the players there?
Well, you're really seeing a lot of groups. You're seeing Sierra Club BC taking a strong stand for protection of creeks and rivers for sensible development of green energy. You have Save Our Rivers, you have BC Creek Protection Society. You are increasingly having groups like David Suzuki Foundation and even Pembina calling for higher environmental standards and more public good if these projects are to proceed. So you still have
a little weaker position than...
Slightly, yeah. I mean, so you still have people along the spectrum and views along the spectrum in the environmental community. But increasingly, and Watershed Watch is another great group that's concerned about what's happening in British Columbia to our creeks and rivers. But increasingly amongst the environmental community, though amongst people that have done due diligence, have actually examined what's happening on the ground, that at the very least are calling for higher environmental standards and increased public good. And I think people realize that, when you look on the ground and you realize what's at stake and you realize 800 creeks and rivers being developed across the province with no assessment of cumulative impacts and no planning, and turning over public assets to private hands, that we have a problem.
It's devastation on a massive scale. We could be number one if we keep this up.
Yes.
And what does Mr. Campbell always call us? The greatest?
Greatest place on earth, or just, and it's so frustrating because you have a government that's been particularly hard on the environment and has cut environmental standards, and we're anticipating further weakening of environmental standards in regards to environmental assessments, especially as they apply to private power projects. And yet, when there's, selling sort of BC to the world, like when you looked at the Olympics and how they're marketing British Columbia, it was beautiful British Columbia, the best place on earth. And yet when push comes to shove and you actually look at what's happening on the ground, we aren't doing what needs to be done to protect the best place on earth.
Gwen, we're almost out of time. Is there any just last thing you'd like to say, or?
I would say don't feel discouraged. It's easy to feel discouraged, but I think that's sometimes what corporations want, or they want people to feel discouraged so they don't take action. And what people need to do is talk to their neighbors, talk to their friends, talk to their family, let them know what's going on, and that there's power in education and action.
Yeah.
And there's projects that have been stopped, like the Upper Pit, which was a terrible project. Glacier Hauser was stopped. We don't know if it was permanent, but again, you had over 1,000 people turn out in a town of 1,021 into the gymnasium. They nearly blew the roof right off. And again, they didn't want to see an incredibly poorly planned project. They wanted to see green power done right. And so there is power in community, there's power in people getting together and standing up for something that's important, and that's green energy done right, that's public power, and that's protecting our wild creeks and rivers in BC.
So folks, Google Western Canada Wilderness Committee. Once again, what's the website?
It's wildernesscommittee.org.
Wildernesscommittee.org. Look them up in the phone book. They're here in town in Victoria as well. There's an office. Call your favorite media outlet, whether it's a television station, a radio station, a newspaper, whatever. Ask them why they're not covering this story. Demand that this story get coverage. The media pretends they're working for us, so make sure that your voice gets heard. Phone them up. Phone your politician and let them know what you think. Now, of course, they're going to ignore you, but it doesn't matter. Keep phoning. This is an issue of vital importance on all aspects, environmentally and economically, and we're getting killed in both aspects. So get involved. There is stuff you can do. Thank you for watching Face to Face. We've been talking to Gwen Barlee of WC Squared.